So we can start. It's a pleasure to have Jonathan here with us today. He's going to talk about how to increase tax collection in DRC. So we have 1 hour and 20 minutes. If it's okay with you, we can start with questions.
Yeah, of course.
You can stand up or sit.
Okay. I don't really know what to do. I guess there's some people online, so I'll sort of try to stand. I guess that's more comfortable. It's the old way we used to do these things. Yeah, so nice to meet all of you. Can I ask if you're comfortable if I remove my mask? I guess some people said that's okay. Yeah, okay, great. Thank you. That definitely makes it a bit easier. Yeah, so thanks very much for having me. I'm delighted to be here in person. It's the first one I've done since the pandemic, so hopefully I remember how to give a seminar in person. And I'm thrilled to present this paper. This is relatively recent work that I've been doing with Augustin, Pedro, John Cabello, who's actually in the tax department in Congo, in the provincial government in Congo, where we're going to be working, and then with Gabe Twerk. So, without further ado, let's just see. Looks like it's some messages you guys can't see. Okay. So we want to think in this project about the assignment of bureaucrats. And I think the basic logic is that, the assignment of workers, both in terms of, creating teams and then assigning workers to specific postings, these are, quite important. There's a large literature in the private sector about how, this is a source of kind of productivity. And so we think that there is ample reason for thinking that this is probably likely to be important in the public sector as well. First of all, this might be an attractive tool because you have quite a few constraints on raising productivity in the public sector through sort of normal strategies that firms often use. So you have, hiring procedures, which are often based on some exam or going to some university, and it's difficult to tie that very closely with, expected on-the-job performance. There may be sort of promotion rules that are based on grade or seniority, time in the state bureaucracy that are kind of independent of performance on the job. And often it's very difficult to fire people. So you have sort of lifetime tenure, again, making usual kind of incentives approaches used in the private sector difficult when you're thinking about bureaucrats. So that's one sort of motivating fact. The second motivating fact is that there's growing evidence or growing recognition, I think, that bureaucrats explain quite a lot of the variation in government performance across space and across the different offices. So 2 recent papers, one in Russia, one in Italy, finding that bureaucrats are explaining between 10 and 25% of the variation in government effectiveness. So you put those 2 things together and it seems like there's a fairly strong rationale for thinking about the assignment of the agents of the state as a potential tool to increase state performance that may also not impose additional kind of resource constraints, whether it's financial or human resource constraints. We'll be thinking about this issue in the context of tax collection in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So the experiment that I'll be talking about is embedded into the 2018 property tax campaign in the city of Kananga in the DRC. And the experiment consists of 2 different stages of random assignment. So first, there'll be a set of 35 different state tax collectors who will be randomly reshuffled into 2-person teams every month of the 6-month campaign. And then each month, those teams are randomly assigned to neighborhoods, one of the 184 neighborhoods in at least this sample of Kananga, which spans about over 20,000 or just close to 20,000 properties. So there's going to be these 2 dimensions of random assignment that we're going to be looking at and thinking about kind of the formation, the assignment margin of these teams and their assignments to neighborhoods. So what our empirical strategy, the way we're going to go about this is through a series of steps. We will, first, we need some kind of estimate of the type of the households, high types and low types. For households, we'll be thinking about the propensity to pay the property tax. And for collector type, we'll be thinking about their kind of ability to collect taxes, their effectiveness as bureaucrats, so as tax collectors in this setting. For the household type, we'll use a fairly unique aspect of our setting, which is that there are these locally embedded leaders, neighborhood chiefs. And I think probably for this audience, you'll recognize a similar institution maybe in some of the places you work. And so what we do is we sort of elicit the ability to pay of each household from this local chief. So there's a sort of pre-treatment, pre-tax collection prediction about the payment propensity of every household in the neighborhood. And for collector type, we don't have a similarly kind of pre-treatment or pre-tax campaign estimate, but we'll use a sort of sample splitting approach and leverage the random assignment of these tax collectors and use a fixed effects estimate of sort of the average level of compliance they achieve across a set of neighborhoods to which they were randomly assigned to return a sort of estimate of their effectiveness as tax collectors. So once we have those estimates of type, which we're going to kind of bin into low and high, we'll estimate the sort of expected tax compliance non-parametrically. So basically looking at various match types and what expected tax compliance you would have in pairing different types of teams of tax collectors with different households. And then once we've done that, we can basically plug those estimates in and look at different possible assignment mechanisms, sort of search over different assignment mechanisms to see, okay, what would actually be the assignment that maximizes tax compliance, while holding constant the marginal distributions in collector type and in collector to household type. So basically holding constant, we don't want to increase the number of teams assigned to any given house. That's one constraint. And then we don't want to increase the overall workload of any tax collector. We want to hold these types of constraints, which were there in the tax campaign, constant. So we're not kind of cheating. And really, this is what we're manipulating as the assignment rather than these other types of factors. So then the impact of the optimal assignment will just be comparing our estimates of tax compliance under the optimal assignment to the status quo assignment in this setting, which was random assignment, as I sort of mentioned before. Okay. So to preview sort of where we're going, we find in this setting that the optimal assignment involves positive assortative matching on both dimensions. So both on the collector to collector dimension and then on a collector to household dimension. So we have sort of this collector to collector complementarity. You only want to form teams of high, and then low, basically, among the two collectors in each team. And then you also observe complementarity on the collector to household dimension. So you want to assign high teams to the high propensity to pay households, and you assign the low ability teams to the low payment propensity households. We dig a bit into mechanisms, and I'll go through this in some detail. We think the evidence is most consistent with an effort sort of story, which I think sort of makes some intuitive sense given a lot of the peer effects literature. But we have evidence that these high ability collectors seem to exert kind of greater enforcement effort. They collect for sort of longer hours, more different days, and that when they're matched with other high ability teammates. And they focus that additional effort in these, toward the sort of high propensity households. And I'll of course go through, why that would increase tax compliance in much more detail. But that's kind of the direction of travel. So then once we've characterized the optimal assignment, I'll turn to, well, what are its actual, effects on tax compliance and revenue. And we estimate that implementing this optimal assignment policy would increase tax compliance by about 37% relative to the status quo, which is random assignment here. And just to give you sort of a benchmark for thinking about the magnitude of this, we compare this to several other policies, but I think one that's interesting is thinking about just you have to replace effectively the 62% of the low ability collectors with high ability collectors to achieve a similar increase. You have to sort of shift, the assignments of 62% of the low ability ones to high ability ones in order to get that same increase in compliance. or you'd have to increase their performance wages by about 69%, which we think are both quite large numbers. So,
I don't know if I should interrupt this early, but I'm just wondering.
Yeah.
So what happens when you put together the low ability with the low ability guys? I mean, don't they decrease their efforts so much that it somehow eats up the positive effect of the high ones? Well, apparently not, but how does that work?
Apparently not. Yeah, I mean, they certainly do exhibit less effort. The low ability guys exhibit less effort, sort of no matter who you're matched with. So maybe you're thinking a little bit about kind of, well, would implementing this optimal assignment demoralize would it
kind of thing
yeah, exactly. Would it demoralize the low guys such that they exert even less effort than
some kind of negative externality?
Yeah. No, it's a really important issue. It's sort of we think about that as almost a potential sort of SUPA issue, because it would be like implementing this assignment would directly affect the effort levels. So I'll have more to say about this. I'll show you those results.
When these last policy, or not the very last, but the one before,
yeah.
where you say you would replace them, I mean, because it could have other kinds of implications, right? So
yeah, exactly. So what we can do is we can look in the campaign, we can look at those collectors who were sort of exogenously assigned to more other low type coworkers, or exogenously assigned to a larger share of low type households. So being sent to work in the harder places, so to speak. And we don't see that either of those things has sort of disproportionate impact on the end line levels of motivation of these tax collectors, as measured by some sort of psychology surveys about motivation. So that's one thing we can do. We can also look at dropout, and there were a small amount of dropout over the course of the campaign. So does, again, being sort of matched with more low types, does that lead you to be more likely to drop out? We don't see evidence that it does. So I think those are really important questions, and it's probably one of the weaker points of the paper is thinking about, well, what are the other things that like implementation of this could do? So there's a great paper by Carroll et al. I think it's Scott Carroll is his name, where they did an optimal matching exercise in schools and sort of had this nice prediction in a prior paper that negative assortative matching would improve students' outcomes, and then when they implemented it, they found the opposite. It actually hurt some of the students. So I'm very aware that we need to think a lot about sort of the implementation and how that may cause some of these sort of SUPA style issues. But from the evidence that we have, we think the demoralization shouldn't be an issue.
Yes, I may follow up on this, although a bit pessimistically, given how you just answered. But I was wondering what would be like general equilibrium effect if you implement this in the longer run. Also on the households who are willing to pay, or on the high performance collectors. I mean, it seems like it would be like a double equilibrium where you have some neighborhoods that are not willing to pay and have low performance tax collectors and are not paying at all. And that might work like during one round of tax collection, but after 3 years, if I see that happening, am I still willing to pay?
Yeah.
Or am I still willing to exert effort? I don't know if you have some result that you could show in this.
That's interesting. I thought about it more from the collector side than the household side. So thinking about how does implementing this change the incentives of the collectors? So are you going to continue to try your hardest or not, or you know what I mean? So I think the way that an optimal government would implement this would be probably to try to keep the types, kind of less salient from the views of the collectors. So I mean, it may be obvious, like if you're looking at like a collector in the right tail of the distribution and a collector in the left tail of the distribution, like who's high and low. I don't think it's super obvious, like for a lot of them in the middle. So to some extent, this wouldn't be, you would implement this. I think an optimal government would implement this, and not make some of those distinctions salient, so they don't know, what's going on. Even if they figured it out, I think the way you would implement this would be to freeze the assignments after a first phase where you're kind of, defining types, let's say, and then, in the future, you just keep the same assignments among the tax collectors, so that you kind of hold constant a lot of these potential sort of incentive issues. I'll have to think more about the incentives of households. I mean, I think from their perspective, that would require quite a bit of knowledge about what the tax authority is doing, which they don't seem to observe. So they just observe someone coming to their doorstep and sort of soliciting payment of the tax. So I don't know that they would be sort of strategically thinking, well, okay, are they going to, is the tax authority optimizing? Are they going to send me a low collector type next time? Something like that. I think that's a little bit beyond the capacity, the level of knowledge of tax administration in most households. If that was the spirit of your question. But yeah, thanks.
Also on the long run effects, I was wondering, can one tax collector learn from their peers and then, get better at this?
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, we have some evidence on that. So again, I can show you that because we do have exogenous variation in sort of how many times you were matched with a high type or a low type. And so, so we do find that there is learning from the high types. What's interesting is that this would be concerning for us if there was more learning from the low types, because in effect, what we're doing is imposing positive assortative matching. So we would kill any learning of low types from high types. What's interesting though is you actually observe more pronounced learning among the high types from other high types. So that would suggest, if anything, we're underestimating the effect of the optimal assignment, because we're going to be facilitating that learning basically in our optimal assignment. But we don't consider those dynamics in our optimization. We can't quite do we can do some things like this, which is a little bit sort of more hand wavy. We can't really do that in our optimization because we don't quite have the power. Yeah.
Can you just clarify what do we have to think about ability here? So what is ability? It's about just how much I collect, independently on how I collect?
Yeah, strictly speaking, that's exactly how we're defining it, is like how much revenue you bring in. I mean, why that's interesting, I think I'll give you more of a description of the context, but a lot depends on these collectors. They have a ton of discretion in this context. These are field-based guys who are going door to door and sort of trying to get people to pay taxes in a setting where only about 10% of people are paying. So it's a hard task, I think, and you need to come up with a convincing pitch for how to get people to start paying the state when they haven't been paying the state in the past. So either you threaten enforcement or you kind of appeal to tax morale, but it's not trivial. You have to. So there is, I think, quite a lot of scope for skill in this kind of a task.
In some sense, corruption here is somehow hidden in ability.
Oh, I see. So no, we're going to measure bribes as well. We have it's just through survey based measures. So, but I validated these measures in past work, so I think it's pretty good. We use like a local code for bribes. So we'll look at collection of bribes. What's kind of interesting in our context, and I'd be curious if this is true in some of the work all of you have done on this, but we find that the high ability types collect more taxes and more bribes. Yeah, so it's positively correlated. So you can see immediately that the implication of the implementing the optimal assignment is that you will also increase bribes by a small amount. And so we'll have a little bit of a back of the envelope on so what social cost of bribes would you need to not want to implement this? I mean, my view off the record is that in most countries, the increase in fiscal capacity has accompanied an increase in bribes. And so off the record, I think we probably shouldn't worry too much about this, but I know that that's not something I would ever say to colleagues at the World Bank or something, since they're very worried about these things.
Performance.
Yeah.
Just another question on the dynamics of I guess motivation of the tax collectors. Are you you're probably getting it, but is there enough? Do you observe them for enough periods that you can test whether being assigned to a really tough assignment in the first period affects how effective people are in later periods? For example,
tough assignments, so tough. You're thinking of tough households, being
if you go to a low household,
a neighborhood that's really hard. Yeah.
Then, does that make you less effective in the future?
Does that make you less effective?
Because this might be an answer to Tom's question.
Yeah. I mean, I think I was referring to some of these results. So we have exogenous exposure to past low type households, and this does I think erode motivation according to these sort of psychology measures of motivation after the campaign. It's not disproportionate for the low types. So I say that because that was our main concern, was that by matching all the low types together or by sending them to these really hard places, they would just get super depressed and sort of drop out, right?
Yeah.
So the evidence doesn't suggest that it's more pronounced. If anything, like the high types seem the ones who are like getting more demoralized by these low type assignments.
They collect fewer grants.
Yes, maybe. And we, we can also look at, the dropouts as evidence of this. We don't see too much of that. We also do an exercise where we like say, okay, if 25% of these people did drop out, what would revenue under the optimal assignment be? And it's still positive, actually. So,
So is there anything apart from corruption? Is there something illegal that these people could do, like
illegal
intimidation of, more aggressive strategies?
So we have evidence on the types of messages that they use. We don't have too much evidence that they ever really actually assaulted or like used violence. Generally, I think, we didn't have any reports of that. We do ask at Nline the citizens, like what do the collectors do? What do they say to you? Do they threaten you? And so we'll look at those messages primarily as a kind of mechanism. So like when you had two high types together, are they disproportionately likely to threaten violence? Like that's the way I'll look at that evidence primarily. We don't find too much evidence of that, but there may be other ways to use that because we have pretty rich data on like all the different types of things that collectors were saying. I mean, subject to the usual issues about recall and kind of self-reporting. Yeah. Great, thanks for those questions. You're anticipating a lot of the key issues already. So what are we trying to contribute here? So first, this literature, growing literature about bureaucrats as a source of state effectiveness. Lots of recent work on sort of selection and incentives. Some work on monitoring and management, and kind of now these two papers I mentioned early on about kind of bureaucrats' quality and the functioning of government. We still think there's relatively limited direct evidence on this assignment margin. So we're hoping to add to that. We're looking at both this, we have random assignment of these public sector workers, and then we have both the teams dimension and the postings dimension. We also have relatively clear performance outcomes. So a lot of this bureaucracy literature sort of struggles to find a convenient outcome measure because it's just hard to assess what bureaucrats do. And whereas we have like tax compliance and revenue and bribes and things. And then we can look at some of these mechanisms using pretty rich survey data. We also are trying to contribute to a small but growing literature on optimal tax administration. So a lot of the early kind of PF development literature focused on tax enforcement, but enforcement's very weak in a lot of these sort of low-income countries, as all of you know, but many of our colleagues and who work in other settings, don't really appreciate this. But in these settings, I think tax administration questions are really, really crucial. I'm thinking about personnel issues, thinking about kind of increasing human capital so that you could use the third-party information that kind of a lot of people in public finance think is so important. And so here we're again sort of thinking about how assignment might be a relatively costless tool, since trying to find revenue to pay for sort of new tax policies is very hard to come by in a lot of these settings. And finally, just to the optimal matching literature itself, this is mostly focused kind of on education. So we're looking at a different context. We also think that our ability to look at these two dimensions is kind of nice, and we can actually sort of we'll run the optimization on both dimension independently and show that each part contributes roughly equally to the overall effect, which is kind of just like a nice additional thing here. So yeah, diving into the context, unless there's any other questions here. So yeah.
So maybe that was not so clear from your introduction. So what could happen to people if people don't pay taxes? So so I'm guessing it's not courts or or police coming and imprisoning people. So what that could happen?
Yeah.
But what is the main problem?
Yeah.
So is it informal? Is there some kind of informal chief's influence that is at stake? So what's the technology?
Yeah, the official, enforce the fines are, as you said, sort of you can go to court, you have to pay the original arrears plus 1.5 times that, and penalties if you're late. and there could be further kind of court actions. In practice, we're considering just sort of a residential sample. We're not looking at commercial properties here. In practice, it's really, really uncommon, except if you're like quite a wealthy person who's fallen out with the politicians. So that said, priors are very heterogeneous on this. And so if you ask people, well, what happens if someone refuses to pay the tax? Then a lot of people think that there will be some kind of sanctions, and that is sustained, I think, through very visible. When the state does enforce sanctions, it uses very visible technology. It sort of puts a lock on the door and says, scellé par la DGI, like, closed by the tax department. And so there's sort of very visible kind of signs of this. So even though, it's kind of off the equilibrium path for a lot of these guys, they hold these beliefs that it's possible. And we're going to look at those beliefs as a possible kind of mechanism for these results. Yeah. So Kananga is the fourth largest city in the country. It has about 1 to 2 million people now. And it's a quite impoverished setting. So average monthly or median monthly household income is about $106. This is a very weak state with close to no formal tax compliance. I guess you can't see the top of my titles there. I'm reading out. So the provincial tax revenue is just like astonishingly low, like 30 cents per person per year in 2015. So it's just like, how could you expect the government to do much with this, right? So they're trying to increase tax revenue by turning to the property tax, which currently is about a quarter of tax revenue at the provincial level. This is all kind of local government. And I think this is quite consistent with what a lot of international tax experts would suggest. So, property tax is always kind of a local tax. The money stays at the provincial level rather than getting remitted to Kinshasa. It's thought to be an efficient tax. It's levied on an immobile asset. I think importantly for a setting like this, where you have very low state capacity, it's kind of quite easy to tax. It's sort of visible, so you can see the thing you're trying to tax. So a lot of work in this sort of PF development space is focused on this issue. And then moreover, urbanization. Africa is the most rapidly urbanizing continent on Earth, and so you have like massive increases in urban property values, demand for amenities, which really should be coming out of something like property taxation. Yet despite all of these potential benefits, it's the single most underexploited tax in relative terms as a share of GDP when you compare low-income to high-income countries.
Just reading my lack of knowledge in property tax, it's about the owner of the house to pay, or also the renter?
There is a separate rental tax, and that is often sort of considered a type of property tax. Here, we're just going to be looking at the ones levied on the owner. Yeah.
And what's the share of owners?
It's 75% of the city. Yeah.
And the tax collector knows that the person that opens the door is the owner.
No, but the tax bill that they give them should go. It's clear it should be paid. Yeah. So even like people will have multiple dwellings, so like the renter there would go to the guy over in who owns it, and they should pay the tax basically. Yeah.
Because that requires repeated visits.
It does. So there's going to be repeated visits for everyone. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. 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 So I think there's like a strong case to be made for the property tax. There may also be sort of, other kind of political economy reasons why this is advantageous. So what they started doing is sort of first systematically collecting property taxes in 2016, meaning kind of these door-to-door tax campaigns where they send out sort of agents literally to each neighborhood, sort of marching through the streets and registering properties, collecting taxes. And this increased property tax payment from about 0% to about 10%. And so now the state is at that level and has been for a little while, and is trying to sort of increase the margin, see what it can do to go up from there. And so this, they're very keen on this paper. This is one margin they're very interested in, and that's sort of, we were discussing sort of the benefits of field work, and so this is one of those benefits. Is this idea emerged from talking to the tax authorities and thinking, well, can't we just pair these guys in different ways? And so that's sort of another example of that, I think. So the property tax here is a very simplified instrument. So it's a fixed annual fee. This is not like a tax rate levied on the value of a property here. There is no valuation roll, which is kind of common in a lot of low-income countries. So to solve that problem, they just come up with this very simplified structure where you just have sort of two bins of house types or property types, which are low value and high value. The low values are about 90% of the city. The high values are about 10%. And so it's like an annual fee of $2 if you're in the low value band, and then an annual fee of $9 if you're in the high value band. And this distinction is based on the building materials. So it's quite sort of obvious when you're outside these houses. Sorry, it's hard to know where to stand. So if it's made out of sort of mud bricks or non-durables, then it's a low value band. And then if it's high value, it's made out of concrete or sort of cooked bricks. And so that's nice because we can very easily sort of assess, the tax collectors will themselves assign the property value band, but we can sort of very easily assess if they did that correctly or not. So if you think about it, these rates may look like super low to you, but it's actually not so far off if you compute property value. We did a kind of a admittedly heroic machine learning exercise here to try to estimate all these property values using some like photo data and other stuff. And so it's like on average 0.34% of a rate of 0.34%, which is actually higher than the state of Hawaii. So, and then getting to Peter's question about sort of enforcement. So yeah, if you don't pay the tax, if you're delinquent on the tax, then in theory you pay the tax plus a fine of 1.5 times, and you could go to court. But this is yeah. So 52% of people think that sanctions are likely in this scenario. Yeah.
What would your neighbors think if you don't pay taxes? Is it a good thing or a bad thing?
That's interesting. Well, one thing is it's a very private thing. Which we were a little bit surprised by, but money matters are very private in this setting. Spouses don't talk to each other about what they make, so there's I think it's consistent with just the culture. But we have other, in other work we've looked at sort of, do you know what your neighbor's tax rate was? Do you know if your neighbor paid tax? People have super low rates of knowledge. So I don't really know. That's interesting. Yeah, I'm not sure if they'd be proud that you avoided paying the tax and not. Yeah, my hunch is that it would vary a lot based on kind of what neighborhood you're in. And yeah.
Because in California, it seems like the main enforcement mechanism is just that if you want to go to the city and get any procedure done, you can't do it until you pay your taxes. Is that the case here? That it's just it's a wrench in the works for anything else you want to do for the city until you pay your taxes.
One thing that I know it's useful for is if you have a property rights dispute and you can show your tax receipt, that helps you. So that provides an incentive for sure. And those are the most common types of disputes that we have. They're very common to have these neighbors debating, arguing over the line between the plots or animals or grazing my lawn. This kind of stuff is very common. So any kind of additional documentation helps your case in court. So that's one clear incentive to pay. Yeah. So getting to the sort of mechanics of the tax campaign, there's going to be sort of two key stages. So these tax collectors will always work in teams of two, as I mentioned. So in the first step, they will create a property register for each neighborhood. So as I mentioned, there's no existing kind of property valuation role. So they literally go door to door and they assess the tax liability based on those building materials. And so we can check if they kind of did that correctly, because it's very kind of black and white. And then what they do is they issue a unique tax ID code and a tax letter to each household, which provides the information about the rate, the how you should pay it, the fines in some cases, et cetera. Then after they've conducted the property register, they receive a kind of, a printed copy of that, and they then go back, so this is getting to the sort of multiple visits, and they make these in-person door-to-door tax appeals. So in theory, they should be going to every property multiple times. First once for that registration visit, and then follow-up visits to actually make these tax appeals. When the person pays the tax, they will collect it right then and there on the spot and issue a receipt using a handheld receipt printer. And a copy of that will be stored in memory of the device, and so we can sort of observe that in the admin data. But this is obviously at the discretion of the collectors. So those follow-up visits are very much at their discretion, and this is going to be an important sort of margin of effort, so the number and the timing of these visits. Also, just like getting to our discussion about sort of threatening people, the tactics and what we were saying about sort of what does it take to be an effective tax collector, the tactics you use as a collector, that's also very much in the discussion of the collector. So, so this is sort of motivating, I think, a little bit like why we think thinking about the collector assignment margin is important in this setting. So who are the actual tax collectors themselves? So these are technically contractors who are hired to work on these tax campaigns. Having a discussion with someone earlier, I'm forgetting who now is Weigel, about how states are so constrained in how many people they can have on their staff that this is how the provincial government sort of organizes these tax campaigns, vaccination campaigns, registration campaigns, all these sorts of things. There's a pool of kind of would-be bureaucrats who are kind of waiting for their time, and they do these sort of contract work in the meantime. And this is pretty common, I think, among a lot of like the frontline agents of the state, the ones who are actually doing the kind of like marching, paying those shoe leather costs and like going door to door. They are about 30 years old on average. They're almost entirely male, and most of them have university education. And then they don't have any regular salary yet, but they do get a kind of piece rate wage for the amount that's proportional to the amount that they deposit in the state account. So so that's what kind of keeps them working on this, as well as possibly they want to get a future job. So that's also there in the background. So what is the status quo? We're obviously going to be thinking about the optimal assignment. What is the status quo? Well, it's random assignment, as I was sort of mentioning before. So every month you have these teams of 2 that are sort of randomly formed. And then those teams are going to be randomly assigned to 2 different neighborhoods, and they'll work in those 2 neighborhoods for the rest of the month. And it's kind of up to them to decide, how to alternate between the neighborhoods. They have some discretion over that as well, so they can concentrate the work in one if they think that's sort of more profitable to do that. But in theory, they're supposed to be kind of doing both once the registration has been completed. We test the random assignment. Things look pretty good, sort of as you expect under normal conditions. So I won't show you those for the interest of time. The median tax collector works with 6 different units and in a total of 12 different neighborhoods, which is roughly like 1,200 properties overall. So we have some good variation, but it's a little bit finite on the teammate side, and so we'll have to think about this a little bit in our in some of our estimations. And why did the government sort of randomize in this way? Well, in addition to sort of a broader, I think, trend, the use of kind of randomized experiments, as we're all familiar with, and sort of within governments and tax authorities, there's a long-standing tradition of reshuffling collectors to avoid collusion. And that's both kind of mixing up teams so that we don't cover for each other, as well as between collectors and households to prevent sort of collusive arrangements cropping up. And there's good evidence that does happen. Like if you're familiar with like the Khan Khwaja-Olkhan series of papers in Pakistan. So there'll be 2 sort of sets of actors that we're talking about. So first, the tax collectors, who are the sort of protagonists here, conducting the property register, doing the actual tax collection. And then the enumerators, that's an independent team that sort of worked for our research organization there. And they did a series of surveys, baseline, midline, endline. We also did a short survey with the tax collectors after the tax campaign was finished. So all of our tax outcomes will come from the administrative data that is sort of generated by this process. And then the rest of the outcomes will come from our surveys, our citizen surveys. So just to be a little bit more formal, we're going to think about collector type as, we'll have 2 different collectors. And again, we can think about this as their ability to collect taxes. That's how we want to think about type here. And we're going to, for simplicity, just have everything discrete. So just think about it as low and high. And then for household type, this will be little v. Again, think of this as like propensity to pay the property tax. And I'll show you, correlates of high types later on. It's obviously correlated with a lot of stuff, but that's how we're defining a household type. So a match is just a triplet of the type of the 2 tax collectors and the type of the household. So then the government seeks to maximize sort of expected tax compliance, which is simply the sort of expected probability of payment conditional on the type of the two tax collectors and the type of the household. Okay, so all very straightforward. We're going to make this assumption, sort of implicit assumption, that the order of the collectors is arbitrary, which, given the nature of the task, makes sense. This is sort of fully symmetric work. They don't really specialize or anything like this. So then the optimal assignment problem is to pick some assignment function f that will maximize expected tax compliance. So f, the distribution, these are just sort of probability mass functions. And the optimal one will maximize expected tax compliance subject to those two constraints that I mentioned in the beginning. So effectively, it's a constraint in the marginal distribution of collector type and household type. So in other words, the first constraint is saying we want not to assign more than one team per household. So you can think of that as like a non-overlapping assignment constraint. And the second is that we want the same number of assignments by collector type. So in other words, we want to keep their workload constant and not just like load a lot of additional households onto the high type teams. Although we will consider some policies that do that, for instance, like just a pure reallocation policy as a benchmark. Okay, so that's basically where we're going. So the first step is just to come up with some definition of these types. So to define household types, we will use these local chief predictions, as I sort of mentioned. So we have these chief predictions in 80 neighborhoods, which correspond to a treatment arm in a sort of larger field experiment. This is kind of in the context of. These chiefs predicted the economic ability to pay of every property owner. They also, interestingly, sort of predicted the willingness to pay of the property owner, but they didn't do that for everyone. That was kind of introduced, that was suggested by the chiefs, interestingly enough, kind of midway through. So we don't have as much power with that one. So we use the ability to pay here. But in their minds, that was very importantly like just different, which I think is kind of interesting. So what they did is they actually sat down and reviewed photographs of every property in their neighborhood, and then predicted the ability to pay with 3 different values: unlikely, likely, and very likely. Okay. This took place after registration, but before tax collection started in each neighborhood. And these 80 neighborhoods where we have these chief predictions, that was randomly assigned. So there's no kind of average difference between the neighborhoods where we have the predictions and we don't have the predictions. So you can just see that it's a bit small, I guess, but the blue neighborhoods, we have the predictions. That's going to be actually where we do most of the analysis in our study. So where we estimate the expected tax compliance function, where we do the optimal matching. And then the red neighborhoods is the other neighborhoods where the same exact tax collectors were working, but we don't have these chief predictions there. So that's going to be those neighborhoods, or we're going to estimate collector type. And then the gray ones are ones belonging to this other field experiment where the state tax collectors were not working. There was another type of tax collector there who was the local chief themselves. And so they're kind of out of our study today because they weren't randomly assigned, and so we can't kind of look at how their assignment affects these potential outcomes. Do you have a question?
Yes, I was wondering kind of what is the utility function of the chief? What is the relation to the different household? Like, is it first, what's the relation to the state? Is it a competitor? Is it a partner? So that talks a bit to your last point. And also, what's the relation to the household? Do they see it as a punishment to the household to send the tax collector to them? Yeah. Or like,
Yeah, it's interesting. It's a very good question. The chiefs here are they definitely collaborate with the state quite a bit in some of these types of activities. So it's not a kind of antagonistic relationship between the chiefs and the state. So they, when the state comes and asks them to do this, they kind of comply. At the same time, they are very much, I think, like if they had to choose between the two, like I think the de facto power lies in the community more than the state. So they really owe their position to like the elders in the community. So they're more of a locally embedded leader. So then why would they go along with this is your question? Well, actually, I think it makes sense if you can sort of influence, or if you, like in essence, they want to try to, kind of minimize the cost of this tax campaign. Think about it that way. So if you can accurately predict, the ability to pay these people, perhaps you can sort of lead to there being a more kind of like equitable or like a better sort of incidence of the tax.
So that is it accurately predicting who to pay, or is it pointing out
your
competitors or people that
so
are so happy or so rich?
I really expected all of that. And we don't find much evidence that they're, we have the chief's family, we have the chief's co-ethnics, and we look at all these types of things, and they were remarkably sort of, apolitical in a lot of this, which was really surprising. And their predictions are kind of quite highly predictive of payment, even if you conditional on being sort of visited. And we have a number of ways of sort of seeing, was the chief, kind of going along behind the scenes and sort of influencing people. It doesn't seem like they were. So yeah, you can see the sort of unlikely, likely, and very likely. So there is a large increase in the probability of tax payment among the very likely. Those judged by the chief to be very likely to pay the tax. So what we'll do with this is then we'll partition this into two types. So we're going to lump these two together since they're kind of closer together, and call that a high type, and then the unlikely guys are going to be a low type. So we will have more high types in the population. So you'll see that in some of the analysis that will crop up. And who are the high types? Well, they're very much kind of who you'd predict. It's like people who have more valuable houses, more assets, more stable jobs, more income, et cetera. Well, also, if you have sort of one concern is that this is kind of a relatively idiosyncratic sort of measure. So maybe how does this travel to other settings? You don't have similarly placed chiefs or chiefs who are kind of more antagonistic. We can also do this with just like the correlates of the households using like prediction, like observables, and then predicting using a split sample approach and some kind of pull down sample, and we get very similar results. So we can do this in another couple of ways.
Another question on context. So what are these people getting for the taxes? So what kind of services today? So is it possible that those guys that pay more taxes are also the ones that receive more services from the municipality, or what's the relationship there? But I'm still wondering about that. So what's the
trash collection, roads and electricity are the main things that should be being covered by this, like street lighting. There's a pretty weak relationship, to be honest, with like how much neighborhoods are paying and how much public goods they're receiving. There is a positive relationship there. There is a correlation. Maybe that's the answer to your question. I think a lot of it though is like this is a setting where they're really only collecting taxes. Like they're only starting to pay taxes for in a serious way, these taxes. So I think that the jury is still kind of out on like let's see what the state can do with these with this revenue.
It's not the case that the bargaining that is going on is like by these tax collectors is so we pay the tax and we put the lamp in front of your house.
It's not that obviously quid pro quo. This is some we don't observe too much like that. So the only thing I've done is sort of the opposite. Like, are the communities where you have better public lighting, are they more or less likely to sort of have a high kind of average level of compliance? You do observe that to be the case. Of course, it could be just wealthier or other types of issues, but the kind of pure quid pro quo we don't see too clearly. I think that's an interesting possible future thing I'd like to dig into a little bit is how the state responds to some of this. Yeah.
So these are just to understand, these are average tax compliance.
Yeah.
So even the ones that are very likely still have tax compliance 12%.
Yeah.
Which means that if the leader expects these people that are paying, in the end, they are not very good predictors. So a lot of people do not pay.
A lot of people don't pay. I mean, the average across the entire setting is about 8% compliance. Yeah, so extremely low. It's true. It's the best we can do. I mean, if we try to use whatever kind of observables we have in the data, we can't beat the chiefs, which is kind of interesting. So like, it's just very hard to predict compliance.
Yeah, it's hard to predict, but in some sense, yes, there's still a large percentage is not predicted by them. So I'm wondering what it means for them. Very likely. Very likely means very unlikely, most probably.
Yeah, it means a little more likely. Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's true. That's true.
About the interpretation of this probability is conditional on the fact that the tax collectors visited them. I mean, are we sure that the tax collectors actually try to collect the tax from everyone? Or
No, they didn't.
That it's only 20% of the household and it's 50% compliance.
Yeah, that's a good point. So this, I think, is unconditional on visits, and then we have it for conditional on visits. I think it's more like 20. It would be more like 22% or something. That's a good point. Yeah, I think it is higher. So they don't visit everyone. I think they visit on average, they go back about 50% or 55% of households on average, if I'm not mistaken. And they concentrate them towards those who are very likely, certainly. But yeah. So it is a little bit higher because it's basically impossible to pay the tax unless you get a follow-up visit. I mean, you could in theory go to the government. There's a way to do that, but it's very rare. Yeah. 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 Okay, so the collector types, the issue with this is we don't really have any kind of like pre-tax collection estimate of collector types. So we don't, have prior tax campaigns or like, the equivalent of past test scores, which is often done in this literature. So we use this, our solution to this is by leveraging that kind of random sample split and then estimating a fixed effects model in a kind of holdout sample where we don't have those chief predictions. So we'll define the kind of no chief prediction sample as a holdout sample. We'll estimate these collector fixed effects, and then we'll kind of rank collectors and bin them into two types. And then in the other sample, which is where we do have the chief predictions, we will actually conduct our analysis. We'll estimate that compliance function and do the optimal assignment. So I've already kind of walked over what all that looks like here. So the type, to be a little bit more specific, is just going to be the average level of tax compliance observed over all neighborhoods to which a tax collector was randomly assigned. So about 6 neighborhoods overall. So we can estimate this by including dummies for each of the tax collectors who were assigned to work in a neighborhood. And one thing is a little, worth noting is we also have sort of these month fixed effects because that was, the campaign was rolled out sequentially on a month to month period. And so that's effectively our randomization strata for these neighborhood assignments. And we'll cluster the neighborhoods in the main analysis at the neighborhood level, and then we'll do some robustness to other ways of thinking about inference in this context. So once we have those OLS sort of estimates of the fixed effects, I mean, we only have 6 neighborhoods, per person, so there is going to be some sort of non-trivial noise. So we're going to use empirical Bayes and sort of shrink these to try to reduce some of the kind of neighborhood effects that are going to be entered in our OLS fixed effects. So I think it ends up looking like this. So here are the OLS fixed effects, and then you can see the shrunk ones. I think on average it's about 18% shrinkage. So there is some, the amount of shrinkage depends on the ratio of the noise and the underlying variation explained by the collectors. So there is, still I think a non-trivial amount of variation here that's explained, by these collectors. And if we estimate that following the literature, we find that that's 36% of the overall variation compliance is explained by these collectors. That seems really high. The previous estimates from the Best et al. Paper in Russia and then the Phoenicia paper in Italy find 24% and 9%. We think the logic is probably because our collectors have a lot more discretion than a standard kind of paper pushing bureaucrat who's like, what they're looking at is like variation in like procurement prices. So, you can imagine that someone who's, kind of unobserved and kind of out there trying to collect taxes has a lot more discretion. So we think this kind of makes some sense. So then, we'll reduce, as I sort of quickly mentioned, we'll just rank the collectors and then sort of split them at the median to bin them into high and low. We'll also look at other ways of doing this. We can look at 3 types, and we'll show you that in robustness as well. And so collector type is obviously correlated with other stuff. They're sort of more educated. They have kind of higher outside options. They're So it's already, so I think that's sort of exactly as you expect. So now we can estimate the actual average tax compliance function. We'll follow this matching literature and do this non-parametrically. So literally, we're just going to have effectively a series of dummies for each of these possible match combinations, where the excluded one is the low, low, low triplet. And we'll include, again, these fixed effects for the month-long time period, since that was effectively our randomization strainer. So this thing will be identified under the random assignments. And in our main estimates, we'll cluster standard errors at the level of assignment, the neighborhoods. So then when we estimate this, again, in that prediction sample, we can then plug in those estimates and then search for the various sort of assignment functions that would maximize tax compliance. Okay, so before I guess I've already told you what the optimal assignment is, but just to motivate a little bit that it's not obvious it would be positive assortative matching, we think that it's not super clear ex ante what you would predict here. So like if you think about the collector to household dimension, really depends on the nature of that task. So if it's if this is kind of like picking low-hanging fruit, going to high-type households, then you might as well just assign the low-type guys there, right? Because then, like, why waste the good ones on the low-hanging fruit? On the other hand, if it's like high-type households are also a challenge, and you know the average amount of compliance, then it sort of probably makes sense to send the high-type households there. Moreover, on the collector-to-collector dimension, at least I think my prior was in a lot of these bureaucracy in a lot of these settings. It's kind of like a box ticking exercise. You just need like one person there to make sure the job is done correctly, right? So you might expect that actually mixed teams would be optimal, because you just assign at least one high type to every office. You can fill in all the kind of chaff, through the offices, and this is the way to make sure the jobs get done. On the other hand, if there are actually some kind of scope for complementarities, either in sort of the tactics they're using, maybe their effort levels, then you might see a logic for homogeneous teams, the positive assortative matching. So to describe the status quo assignments, here I'm just looking at sort of high type households and low type households. Again, the bars are higher here because of the way we cut those off. We took likely and very likely to be high, right? So we have sort of more overall high type houses. And then because it's random assignment, you have twice as much mass at the mixed teams, right, than on the low or the high teams. So then the optimal assignment is the red bars. So you can see that it's advantageous never to form the mixed teams. You only want to form the high teams and then the low teams. And then you want to assign all of the high type households to high teams, except that we have some residual, and we just assign those to the low type guys. But ideally, those would also be working here. So that's kind of just to characterize what our optimal assignment looks like. Yeah.
So just one thing that is unclear to me. So in this case, we just distinguish between low and high type, but within low and high type, there are two types of taxes, right? High and low as well.
Oh, the
rich and poor.
Oh, I see.
How are these distributed into this high and low?
Let's see. This is so we're basically going to. Trying to remember if the main estimates have fixed effects for those. I think they do, because basically the chiefs were they were supposed to give these categorizations essentially within tax rate. So within the ones who are at the periphery, the low types. Sorry, I should find a different way of talking about the low value band. Who's a high type, who's a low type, and the same thing with everyone. So I'm not going to focus on that dimension so much. But I should make that clear that I'm pretty sure these ones, if not the robustness, have great fixed effects. Yeah. Okay, so those that positive assortative matching, as you've surmised, derives from complementarities in collector type and in collector household type. So you can see that just by looking at our estimates of the average tax compliance function here. So if you just focus on the red bars, and you can see that adding one high type collector to a low type collector sort of has a slight increase in maybe tax compliance, but nothing too great. But then if you add a high type collector to one high type, you get a much larger increase. So there's kind of an increasing differences, at least for the high type households. But it is true on average, we do kind of we can do a formal test of whether this is increasing differences, and you can you can reject that at the 5% level. So you have kind of convexity in this collector dimension. You also see convexity in the collector to household dimension. So similarly, if you look at the benefits to assigning a high type household to a low team, maybe there's a 4 percentage point increase in tax compliance, but and it's similar for the mixed team. But then for the high team, there's like something like a 14 or 13 percentage point increase in tax compliance. And again, we can reject that that's a linear increase. We can sort of have evidence that's convex. Okay, so that's the literal complementarity that's sort of generating that positive assortative matching. So why are there complementarities? Yeah.
Do you have an explanation why the standard errors become so much larger for the last category? So is it about extremes in that, or just I don't know, nonce? Do you have an explanation for
that? Let's see. Do I have an explanation for that? I don't have a good explanation off the top of my head for you. Yeah, I guess there's probably just a big right tail, I would imagine. Yeah, that's a good question. I should think about that a bit more.
Is it just mechanical because you have fewer of these high observations?
No, but
no.
Yeah, because we're splitting them between.
I guess that there is somebody that is doing very well and somebody that is doing very bad within. So I'm wondering whether it's the variability of performance within that category that is.
You know what I suspect? I mean, so my hunch, I don't know why this would apply asymmetrically to high types, I guess is my issue. But so the one tricky thing about our standard errors in this setting is that our estimates of collector type our measures of collector type are themselves estimates. And so really we should be factoring in that uncertainty in our standard errors. Whereas here we're just clustering. So we do Bayesian bootstrap resampling, where we basically resample weights and then run weighted OLS. And but the issue there is I don't know why that would asymmetrically apply to the high types to get to your point. So I mean, clearly there's just like I don't think it's an issue of sample. I think it's more an issue of there's just like more of a range of outcomes that we're observing in that bin. But I'll have to think more about that. Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, so what's behind these complementarities? We'll consider two kind of options here. One is skill and one is effort. So sorry, when am I going to like 4?
We have done it 4, yeah.
4, okay. So skill and effort, which I think are kind of natural, ones to look at. So starting with skill, I mean, the idea here would be something like, you need sort of 2 highly able collectors to do this very challenging task of kind of convincing households that really aren't in the habit of paying taxes to actually pay taxes. This is sort of more than just showing up, right? You have to actually, credibly threaten enforcement, or you have to credibly promise public good spending for taxes in some way. And so, there could be some kind of complementarity between the sort of charisma of these 2 collectors, let's say. So we can sort of test this looking at n-line beliefs about these quantities, so about enforcement probabilities or about the provision of public goods. And the idea here is that if this operates through some kind of persuasion mechanism, then we ought to see at n-line amongst those assigned to those match types, we ought to see sort of higher beliefs as an outcome, right? That's the idea. And so we don't see too much evidence of complementarity here, right? So if this was the mechanism, we would expect sort of a similar convex shape, but we don't sort of expect any kind of convex shape. Here, the outcome is these perceived sanctions for delinquency. So that question I was referring to earlier, like what do you think the probability is there'll be enforcement if someone doesn't pay the property tax? Same with taxes spent on public goods. So if anything, it looks almost concave. And then we can start looking at, well, what about these specific messages? So this is getting to our discussion earlier. and here we asked, literally we asked households, what did the collectors say, like when they were trying to convince you to pay? And so, so some were like, sanctions potentially levied by the neighborhood chief, sanctions by the tax ministry, financing public goods, financing public goods both in the neighborhood, so kind of localized, I think getting to the sort of reciprocity stories, versus kind of more at a larger level, citywide level, demonstrating trust in government, et cetera, et cetera. We don't see too much in terms of these beliefs types measures. So we don't think it has to do with some kind of story where there's a complementarity in at least the skills that we're able to measure here through like looking at effects on inline beliefs. So then the other possibility is sort of some kind of more standard pure effect story about just higher effort levels. So maybe when they're paired with another high-type teammate, these high-type collectors exert sort of more enforcement effort. And so what we find is that indeed there's kind of a complementarity in the number of days and hours that are spent collecting among these high-type collectors. So you can see that here. Again, there's that sort of similar convex shape. So the high types are sort of doing disproportionately more days worked here. And we use two measures of days worked. So one comes from the receipt data. You can just see like, are there any receipts for that day? We also take a union of that with another measure, which is based on did they record any kind of chalk dates on the sort of like on the property as they were supposed to provide sort of objective measures of working on a given day. We see this for hours working too. And so, yeah, so there's also an increase if we look at just asking people in surveys. So, did you get any kind of tax visits after registration? Any kind of extensive margin? Like, were you ever revisited? Like I was saying, only 55% ever get a revisit. And also in the intensive margin, how many times did they come back? So this one, we don't see any evidence of convexity, but we do see a kind of pretty steady, sort of looks quite linear kind of increase. We think that's, there's some reporting issues associated with this. So we think that's kind of vaguely corroborating evidence here that it has to do with this effort story. We look at a few other channels. I'll skip those for time. But I think it's still a little bit of a puzzle. Like, so why is actually working longer increasing tax compliance? And what is it about the production function here that means that working for more days, more hours is actually advantageous? So one possible story would be this just has a causal effect on belief. So the more times the tax collector comes to my doorstep, I start to believe, okay, actually enforcement really is, it's real. Like they're going to keep coming until I pay my tax. Or maybe the provision of public goods becomes more credible because this looks like a more high capacity sort of tax collector team. So we already showed you there's no sort of causal effect on beliefs that would be consistent with this story. I think what we think the story is about relaxing cash on hand constraints, which probably for this audience like makes some sense to you. I mean, generally in the property tax literature, this is like widely known. These are bulky annual payments. There's kind of like liquidity issues that often bind with property tax. That's shown in Mexico and the United States, and so you'd expect those issues to be even more pronounced in a setting like DRC. So the sort of suggestive evidence we can provide here is that this additional time collecting from these high teams is really concentrated in neighborhoods with higher employment, higher rates of employment, where these liquidity constraints are much less likely to bind because people actually have gainful employment. We can also show you that there's sort of this shift towards collecting somewhat later in the day, which I think for those of us who work in settings with high degrees of informality, makes sense that the people may be cash rich later in the day after having worked for the morning and sort of come home with your pay. So you can see the blue line here, that's the high teams. There's a sort of shift in the distribution of timings of collection towards slightly later in the day. So that's again consistent with sort of tax collectors reaching people when they have liquidity, when they have the cash on hand to pay. And that being part of the reason why just sort of increasing the number and the duration of time collecting, the number of these visits is increasing tax compliance. Then a natural question is, well, why doesn't everyone just do this? This seems like fairly obvious. And indeed, the tax authorities stressed this point during the trainings. It was very obvious to them that the way to be a good collector is to sort of go make multiple visits, visit at different times of the day. So this isn't an issue of lack of knowledge. I think what's going on is kind of a very simple coordination problem, where if either of the collectors didn't show up, then they both sort of stopped collecting. So you can think of this almost as like an O-ring problem, where you have like any part of the production process fails, and then like the overall level of revenue generated goes to zero. So the logic here is these guys had very strong preferences to work in teams. They really didn't like working alone. They thought they were sort of stronger in representing the state if they were two people. They thought they could be more credible that that money was actually going to go to the state because there's someone else watching you, kind of, which is consistent with sort of very sort of canonical models. So I think that's kind of interesting. But we very seldom see these guys working on their own, even if their partner was delayed. Even though they would earn the same wage. The wages were tied into individual collections, so there's not really a free rider issue here. So, but I think that's also common. I'd be curious if that's true in the places you guys work. But I've heard this in a lot of other settings. There's a strong norm around teams of two. Certainly, anytime I've received visits to our research compound from state agents, there's always two of them. So for whatever reason, yeah. Okay, so turning to the actual impacts of the optimal assignment, this is kind of the headline figure here between the optimal and the status quo. So 7.8% of taxpayers' compliance levels in the status quo, increasing to 10.8% in the optimal assignment. So the average reallocation effect, which is from the matching literature, is about 2.9 percentage points. And that's a 37% increase in tax compliance and a 27% increase in revenue. And then we can look at just what this optimization would be if we only had one dimension of the assignment. So if we did only collector to collector, that would be about a 9.1 percentage point, percent level of compliance, and then 8.7 if we only did the collector to household. So it's coming very equally from those two dimensions of assignment, which we think is kind of neat to be able to sort of disaggregate that. We do a bunch of different robustness exercises. So we take rather than just binning these collectors into two types, we look at three different types. We vary the definition of the collector type. According to the sort of predicting collectors using demographic characteristics, which may be easier for some tax authorities to do. These end up, doing three types actually increases the expected magnitude quite a lot, which makes sense because the matching becomes kind of more efficient. This one looks like the magnitude is quite similar to our optimal. We also vary the definition of household types using just like observables about the households. This might again be sort of easier for tax ministries to do. We also consider different objective functions. So we look at, well, what if the government actually, rather than maximizing tax compliance, is actually maximizing tax revenue, which might be a more sort of reasonable objective. And so then the sort of percentage increase in revenue is a bit larger. We also look at revenue net of bribes, which is sort of an interesting one. It's quite a bit smaller. There's kind of quite a cost to that. So here's tax revenue maximization, and then here's tax revenue net of bribes. So the kind of effect of the optimal policy is 37 rather than 61. So the government's taking quite a hit in its revenue if it really cares. If it puts a lot of sort of, social welfare weight on bribery. So. We also, I think, importantly look at sort of neighborhood level assignments. So much of this has been household level, which may seem a little bit sort of impractical, sending collectors to all these different households, all over the neighborhood. Maybe that's like, think about the transport expenses. So this is perhaps more of like a policy relevant one. And if we define neighborhood like high type and low type based on the share of the number of households, we get a magnitude of sort of 1.7 percentage points compared to sort of 2.9. However, if you define neighborhood type as the number of high types in the neighborhood, you can actually almost recover the main optimal finding. That's a little bit cheating because we're violating our second constraint. We're getting more households to the high type collectors. But I have evidence that they're not time constrained, so we think that probably wouldn't be too much of an issue. So I was quite reassured to see that table. Yeah, we do this thing about sort of computing standard errors with the Bayesian bootstraps, as I sort of mentioned already. to factor in the fact that, those the estimates of type for collectors are actually, estimates themselves. So I can show you that one. So the standard errors here's the Bayesian bootstrap, and here's the original clusters. So definitely increases quite a lot in our main estimate. It's driven by this collector-to-collector dimension, where we're just sort of a little bit underpowered because of the number of assignments we have. The collector-to-household remains significant at 5%. And then one thing we do is we try to speak to the winner's curse issue, which is from a series of recent papers by Andrews et al. So the idea here is that we're potentially, we could be picking the optimal policy in part because of noise, right? Because we're estimating the average tax compliance function in the same sample as we're searching for the optimal policy, right? So it could be that we're picking up the very best one purely just based on some kind of noise. And I guess this is like quite a common thing in a lot of these settings where you're looking for some optimal policy. And that's the idea of the winner's curse here. You're picking not the true effect, you're actually estimating based on noise. We think in our setting, this is like pretty unlikely to be a concern because our estimating equation is just like a series of 8 dummies or something like this. Like there's not so much in our equation to be concerned about this, but nonetheless, we sort of adapt their methodology for a more continuous setting like ours, and it actually doesn't really affect our estimates too much at all. So this is the compliance maximization and revenue maximization, the headline number based on our benchmark, and then the conditional estimator and the hybrid estimator. Those are the two from this literature.
And yeah. Going back to your previous point on the fact that the tax collectors are unconstrained on time. Like, is there a version, like, do you know how much they prefer to work? Is there a version of this where you let the tax collectors choose how much they prefer to work, and then since the high tax want to work more, you let them and assign them more?
I see. That's interesting. Yeah, I think another interesting one is letting them choose their partners. That would be quite interesting. Like, can they do better than our optimal matching based on some kind of unobserved knowledge about type, or maybe it's about at that level, maybe it's more about like, sort of social incentives. Like I like to work with my friends, so I work harder. So that's something we're considering. I think we're very likely to implement a version of this because our co-author here is very excited about the results and sort of wants to see it play out. So maybe that comparison, the sort of choosing your partner versus like being assigned the optimal partner, is like the one we're kind of leaning toward. But yeah, it's interesting thinking about other dimensions, like how much do you want to work? Yeah, should you take on a larger share of the workload? That's interesting. I should think.
And especially if they're getting paid, on commission, like they're making a piece rate, then let the guys who are best at it work as much as they want. Right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's interesting. Sometimes there are a few like violations of the assignments that we ignore. We use the intent to treat kind of thing. Yeah. But there's a few cases where someone's sick and then like a really good collector will be like, oh, I can do it. So I think your intuition is probably sound. Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, so then we go through these sort of SUPA spillover kind of concerns, which we talked about at the very beginning. So I can just show you a couple of those. So we talked about, I don't know if I can show you that one. The demoralization results. So if you work with more low-type teammates, for instance, how does that affect your motivation levels at endline? So we do find at endline the low-type collectors do have lower motivation, endline motivation, which actually they had lower baseline motivation as well, so it sort of makes sense. They're not systematically kind of affected by having worked with a larger number of past low-type collectors. If anything, the high-type guys get bummed out working with low-type collectors, so it sort of goes in the opposite direction. And then we can look at the dropping out results. So we don't find so if you look at whether they're going to drop out entirely, a similar kind of table to the one I just showed you, we don't see any effects. If you're really worried about kind of this dropout, this is kind of what we estimate would happen if you had like just a share of low types just completely dropping out, not collecting a dime, like dropping out on day one, no, I'm not doing this work, and the state doesn't even replace the person, then you would still, you know, if 25% of the people dropped out, you'd still have sort of a positive benefit from the optimal assignment with like a 95% confidence interval, and it's up to 50 with the 90% confidence interval. So this is kind of our worst case for us. Is kind of this this situation. Yeah, and then the other set of issues is kind of endogenous learning. So one possible thing is kind of learning by doing, which you could imagine. We don't find too much evidence of learning by doing here, which is a little bit surprising to me. I don't really understand why that is, but they do learn from each other. And of course, this would be a concern if we saw sort of systematically higher levels of learning from other high types among the low types, because then these mixed teams would be sort of disadvantaged. But we don't see that. If anything, so if you look at these interactions, if anything, the kind of high types are the ones learning systematically more from being paired with other high types. So this means we could in fact be sort of underestimating the optimal policy's impact. Okay, so that's kind of the main story here. I only have 5 minutes left. So we compare our results to a few different benchmarks. So what happens if you just reallocate work from the low types to the high types? How much of that work would you have to reallocate to achieve the same treatment effect? And it turns out to be about 62% of their work. So we think that's quite a lot. And that's also ignoring any kind of workload effect. Like, now I have way more work than before. I actually become less productive as a high type. Similarly, if you just did a policy kind of like in the teacher value adding literature, just like hiring people of average quality, how many people would you have to fire? How many load types would you have to fire of average quality to get to that optimal policy? And it turns out you never get there. You never actually recover the same. We can look at the effect of sort of collector financial incentives. So as I mentioned, they get this piece rate. So maybe the story is let's just jack up the piece rate until they're kind of collecting more, and this would be a better way to go. We do have some random variation in their performance incentives, so we can look at this. And you do find that not surprisingly these higher sort of collector bonuses increase compliance. But you need to increase these wages by 69%, which is a lot. And in fact, in revenue terms, this backfires because there's kind of this mechanical increase in the wage bill. And so you actually end up decreasing revenue with this policy. So, and this is, I think, quite consistent with I don't know, those of you who worked in sort of tax authorities in developing countries. I think this is why we have to think about, assignment margins, because these types of tools don't work very well in these settings. On the distribution of the impact of this optimal assignment, it turns out it would very likely fall on kind of richer households. This would actually be kind of progressivity inducing, I guess. The high types, not surprisingly, have sort of nicer properties. This actually would shift the tax burden, toward that wealthier set of households. And so very briefly, just on bribes, we do observe, we have 3 different measures of bribes. So one is just a sort of a self-report using a local code for a bribe in a setting, which I've validated in other work. Then we have ask the magnitude, and then we look at the gap between sort of, self-reported payment and admin data. And we do see some sort of, I think, suggestive evidence of an increase in bribes. It's not really strong, especially for the bribe magnitude, very small increase. So, but this is kind of consistent with what I was saying before. You do see it just if you look at fixed effects of bribes and taxes, there is this sort of positive association between the two. So what we do is
tax collectors or the
households. Yeah, those are all household outcomes. Yeah, exactly. So if we just sort of put some, welfare weights or some marginal rate of substitution between taxes and bribes, lambda, how much would the government have to value these bribes in order to choose not to implement the optimal policy? We find that this estimate, lambda, would have to be larger than around 4, I guess. Yeah, so I don't know how you assess that number, but there it is. Okay, I'm going to skip the other outcomes because basically we don't find anything on we look at other payment of other taxes. We don't really find any kind of interactions there. We also look at views of the government and of taxation generally. We don't really find any kind of erosion of views of the government or more trust or something like this. So not much to there. Yeah, so, and then this is just a summary slide, so let me just conclude. So this field experiment, again, was sort of looking at this, the assignment margin here. We found that there's positive assortative matching on both of these sort of collector type and collector household dimensions. And that we think reflects this sort of story about, kind of higher effort, enabling collectors to coordinate better and reach households when their cash on hand constraints are not binding. I think that's the mechanism there. And this would increase compliance by about 37%. So, ultimately, I think the government is quite excited about this. They view this as sort of a free, kind of free way to increase tax compliance, tax revenue. So we'll probably bring it to the field and see, see if our thoughts on the SUPA violations are true, or if this thing kind of, backfires in ways we're not anticipating. So, yeah, thanks a lot for your really interesting questions.
We don't have time for more questions, but I think you have some time free now.
Yeah.
So if somebody is willing to ask more questions,
yeah, I'll be around. Yeah.
You don't need a break. I think you have about an hour.